In the autumn of 732, just outside the French city of Tours, the destiny of Western civilization teetered on the blade of a Frankish weapon. Muslim forces had been an unstoppable juggernaut for precisely a century, sweeping across territories from the Indian subcontinent to the Iberian Peninsula, obliterating the mighty Persian realm, severely weakening the Byzantine power, and turning the Mediterranean Sea into an Islamic domain. At this moment, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi commanded the mightiest Muslim invasion force Europe had ever witnessed. Arab historical records boasted of 400,000 warriors, while contemporary scholars estimate closer to 80,000, marching northward from Spain toward the treasure-laden religious houses of St. Martin of Tours. Blocking their advance stood 30,000 Frankish fighters led by Charles, the palace mayor, who would soon earn the title Martel, the Hammer, because of what he was prepared to unleash upon Muslim warriors on that blood-drenched autumn battlefield. The Islamic territorial expansion that delivered Abdul Rahman to Tours represented humanity's most rapid conquest. Beginning in 632 following Muhammad's passing, Muslim armies had seized more land in a single century than the Roman Empire had captured in 5 centuries. They completely annihilated the Sassanid Persian dynasty, transformed the Byzantine Empire into a fractured remnant, captured the entire North African coastline, and in 711 crushed the Visigothic Spanish kingdom in one devastating engagement. The Umayyad Caliphate now extended from the Indus waterway to the Pyrenees mountain range. Their military forces appeared unbeatable, their mounted warriors legendary, their religious conviction propelling them to extend Islam across the entire known world. Europe, fragmented into bickering principalities and territories, appeared like overripe harvest waiting to drop into their grasp. The Spanish conquest had demonstrated to Europeans how rapidly their civilization could crumble. In 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad had sailed from Africa with merely 7,000 soldiers. Within 3 years, virtually the complete Iberian landmass belonged to Muslim authority. The Visigothic aristocracy who had governed Spain for 3 centuries were either slaughtered, embraced Islam, or cowered in mountain refuges. Christian houses of worship transformed into Islamic prayer halls. The Latin tongue yielded to Arabic, and Christian youth were educated as Muslims. The velocity of this collapse horrified European monarchs. If Spain could dissolve in 3 years, how long could France endure? How long before the call to prayer resonated from Notre Dame? How long before European nobility prostrated themselves toward Mecca? Charles wasn't destined to become Christianity's deliverer. Born illegitimate, he had grabbed control of Francia through internal warfare, developing a reputation for savagery that stunned even by medieval standards. He had imprisoned his own father's widow, banished his own kin, and demolished his adversaries with a mercilessness that generated loathing from the religious institution he would ultimately rescue. Yet this identical brutality had molded the Franks into Western Europe's most regimented combat force. Charles had dedicated 2 decades battling Saxons, Bavarians, and rival Franks, building a professional military that fought for spoils and territory rather than feudal duty. These weren't gallant knights in polished armor, but executioners in grimy chainmail, warriors who viewed combat as their profession and excelled at their deadly craft. Abdul Rahman's military force represented the era's most advanced fighting machine. The nucleus comprised Syrian and Yemeni mounted troops, hardened veterans of innumerable campaigns, wielding Damascus-forged blades that could slice through European metalwork like fabric. Berber-mounted archers from North Africa could release 3 projectiles while charging at maximum velocity. The foot soldiers included Slavic enslaved warriors, Christian converts from Spain, and Arab professionals who had trained for warfare since youth. They transported siege machinery that had breached the fortifications of Persian metropolises and Byzantine strongholds. Most frightening were the Moorish mounted warriors who fought with venomous arrows and were whispered to consume the hearts of their adversaries. This wasn't merely an army but a phenomenon that had never tasted failure. The Muslim expedition wasn't solely conquering for divine purpose. They were pursuing economic gain. The religious institutions of Francia, especially St. Martin of Tours, possessed centuries of accumulated Christian riches. Golden crucifixes, silver communion cups, jewel-encrusted holy texts, and the contributions of countless pilgrims rendered these spiritual centers wealthier than numerous kingdoms. Abdul Rahman's reconnaissance reported that St. Martin's treasury alone could finance military campaigns for generations. The Muslim approach had consistently combined religious expansion with economic plunder. The treasures of France's churches would bankroll subsequent conquests, potentially into Germanic territories, potentially toward Rome itself. The monks, understanding what approached, were already concealing valuables and escaping northward with whatever they could transport. For 7 days in early October 732, both armies confronted each other near Tours, neither prepared to initiate combat. Charles had stationed his warriors in a phalanx arrangement on elevated terrain among woodland, eliminating the Muslim cavalry superiority. Abdul Rahman attempted to lure the Franks forward with mounted harassment and arrow barrages, but Charles remained immovable. The Franks stood like an ice wall, according to Arab historical accounts, motionless and soundless. Meanwhile, the climate was deteriorating. October in northern France meant frigid precipitation and mist. conditions that benefited the Franks who wore thick animal pelts and wool, while the Muslims accustomed to Mediterranean and arid environments shivered in their lighter protective gear. Each passing day witnessed Muslim confidence decline as their provision routes stretching from Spain began collapsing. On October 10, 732, the precise date remains contested. Abdul Rahman could delay no further. His provisions were depleting, and Charles had positioned himself between the Muslims and their plunder targets. The engagement commenced with Moorish cavalry assaults attempting to shatter the Frankish shield barrier. The Franks had established what they termed a sealed wheel, interlocking shields forming an impregnable obstacle with spears protruding like a porcupine's quills. Successive waves of Muslim cavalry slammed into this structure, horses shrieking as they pierced themselves on Frankish spearpoints. Riders hurled and crushed. The Arabs described it as striking an iron mountain. For countless hours the sequence repeated. Assault, collision, withdrawal, reorganize, assault again. Corpses of animals and warriors accumulated before the Frankish position. What rendered the Frankish resistance remarkable was its order under circumstances that would shatter most armies. Muslim projectiles descended ceaselessly, discovering openings in shields and protection. Frankish soldiers collapsed, but others instantly advanced to seal the breaches. Nobody abandoned formation to assist injured companions. Nobody pursued withdrawing adversaries. They endured and withstood hour upon hour what one historian termed martyrdom while standing. Charles had threatened execution to any warrior who abandoned formation, and his notoriety guaranteed universal belief. The Franks sustained losses that would have scattered other European forces, their position bending but never shattering, resembling a tree in a tempest that flexes but doesn't topple. As the day progressed and Muslim cavalry exhausted themselves against the Frankish barrier, Charles observed something critical. The Muslim offensives were becoming chaotic, their mounts spent, their arrows diminishing. He had anticipated this instant. With a horn signal, the complete Frankish position abruptly surged forward. The ice wall became an avalanche. The Franks didn't merely advance. They stormed downhill with the momentum of their substantial armor amplifying their force. The psychological impact on the Muslims was catastrophic. The immobile obstacle had suddenly transformed into an irresistible power. Frankish battle axes and blades engineered for intimate warfare commenced their horrific work. The designation Martel the Hammer originated from this instant as Charles personally spearheaded the assault, his weapon ascending and descending like a metal worker shaping iron. When infantry engages cavalry in restricted terrain, the advantage transforms dramatically. The Muslims, compressed together and incapable of maneuvering their animals, became casualties rather than combatants. Frankish battle axes could eliminate both mount and rider with a solitary strike. The Franks operated in teams, one warrior snagging a rider with a hook or spear, the other crushing his head with an axe or club. Arab chronicles characterized the noise as thunder that wouldn't cease. The perpetual crash of steel on steel, the screams of horses, the expiring prayers in Arabic blending with Frankish battle cries. Blood rendered the terrain so treacherous that combatants were slipping in mud created from earth and carnage. The Muslims attempted to withdraw but discovered themselves forced forward by their own rear formations who couldn't witness the massacre ahead. In the pandemonium of the close combat, catastrophe befell the Muslim military. Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, attempting to rally his fragmenting forces, was encircled by Frankish combatants. Some narratives claim Charles himself delivered the fatal strike, others that nameless Frankish soldiers simply dragged him from his mount and butchered him. The emir's personal standard collapsed into the mire and with it vanished Muslim resolve. The shout echoed in Arabic, "The commander has fallen, the commander has fallen." Terror propagated through the Muslim formations faster than wildfire. An army that had never retreated commenced fleeing. The regimented force that had conquered from India to Spain disintegrated into a horde of panicked warriors attempting to escape Frankish battle axes. As twilight descended on October 10th, something extraordinary occurred. The Franks, depleted from the day's combat and suspicious of deception, didn't chase. Charles commanded his warriors to maintain their stations, anticipating a Muslim dawn counteroffensive. The Muslims, meanwhile, withdrew to their encampment in absolute disorder. Without Abdul Rahman, leadership hierarchy collapsed. Syrian formations blamed Berber formations for the failure. Arabs quarreled with Christian converts and everyone blamed everyone else. In the blackness, some Muslim formations actually battled each other, believing they were attacked by Franks. The encampment became a nightmare of bewilderment, fratricide, and escalating terror about a Frankish nocturnal assault that never materialized. When dawn broke on October 11th, Frankish reconnaissance approached the Muslim encampment with extreme vigilance, anticipating an ambush. Instead, they discovered it deserted. The complete Muslim army had escaped southward during the darkness, abandoning tents, provisions, casualties, and an immense quantity of treasure seized from French churches. The Franks couldn't comprehend it. They had triumphed so decisively that the adversary had evaporated. Charles suspected deception for hours, dispatching cavalry to locate the Muslim army, but they had vanished, streaming back toward Spain in complete disarray. The Franks descended upon the abandoned encampment like predators, discovering gold and silver from 100 subjugated cities, enslaved people from across Europe, and armaments from Damascus forges. Charles didn't permit the Muslims to escape effortlessly. Once he verified their withdrawal was genuine, he released his cavalry in pursuit. For 7 days, Frankish horsemen hunted fleeing Muslims through the French landscape. No clemency was granted. Stragglers were struck down wherever they stood. Muslim formations that attempted defensive stands in settlements were encircled and massacred. The routes to Spain transformed into passages of death, scattered with corpses for hundreds of miles. Indigenous farmers who had concealed themselves from the Muslim advance emerged to execute wounded adversaries with agricultural implements. The Mozarabic Chronicle asserts 300,000 Muslims perished, though this is undoubtedly inflated. Contemporary estimates indicate 10,000 to 30,000 Muslim fatalities, but the psychological rout was absolute. The riches abandoned in the Muslim encampment revolutionized Frankish governance permanently. Charles allocated the treasure among his combatants, establishing a devoted military class that owed everything to him. Wealth that had been pillaged from Christian churches was restored, securing Charles the Church's appreciation despite their former animosity toward him. The reclaimed wealth financed the establishment of Western Europe's most formidable military power. Charles utilized Muslim gold to finance Muslim defeat, converting captured assets into the cornerstone of what would evolve into the Carolingian Empire. The monastery of St. Martin, preserved from annihilation, became a pilgrimage destination where Christians offered gratitude to God for salvation. Information of the triumph propagated across Europe like wildfire. The Pope in Rome proclaimed days of thanksgiving. The Byzantine emperor transmitted congratulations. Even the Anglo-Saxon realms, typically contemptuous of Frankish matters, acknowledged that Charles had protected them all. The engagement became legendary almost instantaneously. Charles was no longer merely a Frankish military leader but Christianity's champion, Europe's shield, the hammer of the unbelievers. Chronicles composed within a generation transformed Tours into a civilizational confrontation where Christianity's fate balanced precariously. Every European kingdom suddenly desired alliance with the Franks, recognizing them as the emerging military superpower. For the Muslim world, Tours was a psychological disaster. The army that had never suffered a significant engagement had been defeated by inferior numbers. The inevitable progression of Islam had been arrested. Arab chronicles attempted to diminish the setback, characterizing it as a martyrdom expedition rather than a conquest endeavor. But the reality was transparent. Islamic territorial expansion in Western Europe was terminated. The Umayyad administrators in Spain redirected their focus to consolidating Iberian authority rather than capturing new lands. Internal disputes that had been suppressed by continuous triumph erupted. Within 2 decades, the Umayyad Caliphate would disintegrate entirely, partially due to the prestige loss from Tours. The Muslim withdrawal from Tours didn't terminate Islamic presence in France immediately. Raiding parties continued operating from strongholds in Septimania and Provence for years, but these were raids, not territorial seizures. Charles dedicated the subsequent decade methodically eliminating these Muslim outposts using identical Frankish infantry strategies that had prevailed at Tours. Each triumph augmented his legend and authority. By 739, the final Muslim forces had been driven from France. The Mediterranean shoreline, which had appeared destined to become an Islamic frontier, remained Christian. The cultural and spiritual map of Europe, which might have appeared vastly different, was established in a configuration that endures today. Tours demonstrated a military breakthrough that would characterize European combat for centuries. Disciplined heavy infantry could vanquish mobile cavalry. The Frankish approach, standing resolute in compact formation and grinding down attackers, became the blueprint for European armies. The renowned Swiss pike formations, English longbow arrangements, and Spanish tercios all traced their tactical lineage to Tours. Charles had demonstrated that European combatants, despite lacking the maneuverability and refinement of Muslim forces, could triumph through discipline, positioning, and absolute stubborn refusal to collapse. It was a principle that would resonate at Hastings, Crécy, and innumerable other battlegrounds. Triumph at Tours transformed Charles from accomplished warlord to legendary kingmaker. Though never claiming the throne himself, he governed Francia with total authority. His son Pepin the Short would become monarch, and his grandson would be Charlemagne, Emperor of the Romans. The Carolingian dynasty that would dominate Europe for centuries was constructed on the foundation of Tours. Charles utilized his prestige to restructure Frankish society, establishing the system of mounted combatants supported by territorial grants that would develop into medieval feudalism. The heavy cavalry that Charles developed following Tours, financed by Muslim gold, would become the knights who dominated European warfare for 500 years. The Church, preserved from Islamic conquest, experienced its own transformation. Charles, the illegitimate son they had scorned, became their greatest champion. Monasteries competed to assert connection to the engagement. Churches were consecrated to Charles despite his never being sanctified. The triumph was credited to divine intervention, with accounts of angels battling alongside Franks and the Virgin Mary manifesting above the battlefield. This religious interpretation validated centuries of Christian warfare against Islam. The Crusades, commencing 350 years later, explicitly referenced Tours as justification. If Charles could repel Islam in Europe, Christians could repel Islam in the Holy Land. Scholars endlessly argue what would have transpired if Abdul Rahman had prevailed at Tours. Would Muslim armies have subjugated France, Germany, perhaps even reaching Scandinavia? Would Europe today be Islamic rather than Christian? Would the Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment have materialized under Islamic governance? The Arab chronicles indicate their objectives were constrained: plunder the monasteries and return to Spain. But successful raids frequently became conquests, as Spain itself had demonstrated. What's indisputable is that Christian European civilization as we recognize it might not have existed. The languages, legal systems, artistic expressions, and philosophy that define Western culture were protected by Frankish axes on that October day. Contemporary archaeology has validated the fundamental narrative of Tours while disputing some specifics. Excavations near the battlefield have uncovered concentrations of weaponry and skeletal remains consistent with a major engagement. The distribution of Muslim currency in France displays a sharp discontinuation after 732, validating the withdrawal. Frankish armaments from the era show adaptations specifically engineered to counter cavalry, extended spears, heavier axes, and reinforced shields. Mass burial sites discovered in the 1950s contained remains displaying trauma consistent with the described combat. The physical evidence confirms a decisive Frankish triumph that permanently terminated Muslim territorial expansion in western France. The Battle of Tours casts a shadow that reaches to the contemporary era. It became a founding mythology of European identity, the moment when Europe defined itself against an external menace. During the Ottoman invasions of the 16th century, Tours was invoked as inspiration. During the colonial era, Europeans rationalized conquest as retaliation for Tours. Even presently, political movements invoke Tours as a clash of civilizations moment. The engagement has been appropriated, misinterpreted, and mythologized far beyond its actual historical importance. Yet the fundamental fact persists. In October 732, Frankish combatants halted Islamic expansion into Western Europe, and the ramifications shaped a millennium of history. Tours established doctrines that would govern European warfare for centuries. First, that defensive positioning could overcome numerical disadvantage.